Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Nima of economicsjunkie.com and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. This is episode 2, the Federal Job Guarantee. And I got with me Dylan Moore, and we're going to discuss what is unemployment. So, Dylan, what do you think about what causes unemployment in our modern day fiat money economy?
My parents.
Correct. And then who else?
So, as we were discussing last time, the unemployment of any society is actually caused by the government imposing a tax.
Correct. And we touched on that in our quite elaborate podcast last episode about how when I tell everyone who lives, in my tribal area or, in my country, you now all owe me this money. And by doing that, I introduce that new currency, let's call it Nima bucks. Nobody will have those Nima bucks initially. I need to start introducing the money into circulation in order for people to have it so they can pay the tax that I've imposed. So in other words, the government, by imposing a tax, makes everyone unemployed. Everyone now needs money in order to pay a tax, and they don't have the money. So the government causes the unemployment by doing that. And for that reason, modern monetary theory argues that that the free market cannot solve the unemployment problem by itself. In fact, if the government were to just impose a tax and sit back and do nothing, then they would have to start taking people's private property instead of money, and everyone would just be completely broke and in debt to the public sector. So let
me interrupt you real quick, just to reemphasize this. And we went over this in the last episode. Is this isn't a story or a theory that we're making up? This is this idea of government imposing a tax first and then introducing a currency later through spending is backed up by the historical, archaeological and anthropological record, where this is the way societies have always made money. We went in depth over the myth of the barter theory of money, where there never was any free-formed market that occurred with people exchanging goods with each other in an economic sense before a government came along. Yeah. And the story of people exchanging goods and then finding some common medium of exchange, for example, gold or silver, and then the government coming along and taxing that gold or silver in order to spend it on things that they want to spend it on, even though the free market came up with it in the first place, is actually backwards from the evidence of history. The evidence of history appears to show that states preceded markets. States demanded taxes, which created a unit of exchange, or I guess the best way I like to describe it is a unit that measures value that can be exchanged. And from there, markets sprung up.
Yeah, or a unit that records debts owed, you could say. And
of course, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so when the government spends money into existence, let's say 10 Nima bucks, and all that's saying is, I owe you the discharge of a tax liability worth 10 Nima bucks. And, then whoever receives those 10 Nima bucks, when they pass those Nima bucks on to somebody else, then in turn that person is owed that discharge of tax liability. So you're basically shifting around records of debts owed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a little freaky. I mean, particularly if we're coming from an angle of, okay, how do we, instill freedom by in the very least lessening violence? We're saying that the very fundamental unit which allows us free exchange, its value, everyone talks about, well, what's the dollar or what's money backed by? It's backed by the violence of the state.
Correct.
And that violence of the state saying, hey, you owe this tax in Nima bucks or dollars or euros or whatever, that makes you unemployed, because the definition of unemployment is you're willing to exchange work for currency. That's the unit of exchange, and the unit of exchange is simply, what you can pay your taxes with. So, moving one logical step at a time here, it becomes pretty bizarre, because like Nima was saying, this is a government-created problem, and it's ridiculous to expect the free market to solve the problem created by this government tax. Now, I want to make a small caveat. I understand that, many of the listeners might be saying, yes, of course, we understand that the government creates this money out of nowhere. And, we'd like to not have to deal with the tax at all. And, that's an interesting conversation, which me and Nima have spoken about at length and we'll probably make a future episode about. But for right now, seeing as the fact that we live in a state of society and we got to deal with state of things, at least for, 3, 4, 5 generations, we better learn how to live in the world that we're in now. So if the government created this problem of unemployment and the free market can't solve it, simply by definition of terms that we're using, what is this horrible sounding thing that we're calling the federal job guarantee, Nima?
Yeah, so the federal job guarantee, or as Warren Moser calls it, the federal transition job, is a program wherein the government, after imposing the tax, offers work that pretty much anyone around the country can do. The ways in which this transition job have been suggested is such that you would not necessarily need a federal centralized authority that decides, okay, who's going to work on which bridge and what monument or whatever, but rather you make federal grants available to local communities on the most local level possible, ideally, I'd say. And then, they can employ people to do whatever needs to be done in the community. It's really hard to make the case that there's no work to be done in any community, I think, right? So you could employ people for very simple things. And there have been some programs in other countries where textiles were produced and stuff like that. And that would probably be the most decentralized way you could solve this problem that's been created by the government.
So now I'm not trolling when I ask this. How is this not socialism? To suggest that, and I'm serious, because I'm sure a lot of people are thinking this. To say, okay, if we're just going to start employing everybody into the public sector, what slows it down from just encapsulating the entirety of society and the entirety of the government, or excuse me, the entirety of the people living in that society, and turning us into a full-blown centralized command economy?
Yeah, one crucial aspect of the transition job is that that the wages paid cannot compete with the private sector. So whatever you get in the federal transition job It would have to be, it basically effectively would constitute a minimum wage, but it would be a minimum wage that doesn't have to be declared by law or whatever. It would just be the wage that is implemented in this program. And if people want to earn more, then they would have to go into the private sector. And so the federal transition job, the transition job program would essentially be a pool of workers who haven't been unemployed, who are not on welfare, who are learning how to be disciplined, who are working on jobs, etc. And those people would always be readily available to be hired into the private sector. So what we're suggesting is not socialism, because socialism doesn't recognize the private sector. Socialism is, I guess it depends on the type of socialism, but in essence, socialism is a public ownership of the means of production, and that's not what we're suggesting at all. We're just suggesting a small buffer program that is required because of the technicalities of how the fiat money system works. And ultimately, the goal is, of course, to have as large a private sector as possible. Because you're not helping the private sector if you're not giving it the purchasing power that is needed based on the amount of taxes that are charged to the individuals in the economy.
So that's the interesting next point, which is everyone's biggest concern. So, which is inflation, right? So if we say, okay, let's assume, Dylan and Nima, that you're maybe kind of right about this idea that, when the government prints money, it's just money that's out there. It doesn't have to be paid back, and that government bonds are simply another U.S. security that's like a savings account compared to cash, which is a checking account or reserves that you might have at a bank. How is it that if we just start creating more money in order to employ all these people, that we're just not going to have runaway inflation?
Yeah, so because the private sector has a sort of natural desire to net save in aggregate, which is something the public sector doesn't have. Private sector wants to net save to be prepared for future uncertainties, to be prepared.
Can I interrupt you right there? Mm-hmm. That was an interesting idea. So you said the private sector has a desire to net save, but the public sector doesn't. Mm-hmm. Now, I intuitively understand why I would want to save. I mean, I want to hear your in-depth explanation of why it's in the what that specifically means in the aggregate. But why would the public sector not need to net save?
Because the public sector can create the money into existence out of nothing. So they, like you said last time, they have a magic pouch of money. They never need to worry about having any or not having any money. I guess, in fact, as Warren Mosler said, the public sector never has nor doesn't have any money.
Right. So it doesn't, to say that, to talk about the public sector saving or not saving actually doesn't even make sense.
Right. Exactly. It's a false term, if you will. So the private sector.
Okay. Yeah. So I interrupted you explaining about the public sector needing to save. Excuse me, the private sector needing to save.
So the private sector likes to net save. So there's a certain amount that they don't necessarily spend on consumption. And so just because we've created new income earners, it doesn't mean that they'll immediately create inflation. Number one, because people want to net save. And then on top of that, right now we're in an economy that is so underutilized, that is so under a regime of austerity, and I think that applies to almost all Western governments around the world, that there's going to be free resources that will be utilized from the additional spending. There's no existing employed resources that have to be bid out of the private sector, or where the spending would be bidding up what's already being used in the private sector. In the US, for example, industry capacity utilization is only at something like 75% or so. It started going up, as we discussed last time, since Trump has been elected into office, in my opinion, because of the tax cuts and a lot of the scrapping of a lot of really stupid environmental regulations that are nothing but austerity, essentially. So as long as there's free resources available, and the industry capacity is unutilized, the additional spending on something like federal job guarantee does not really have to cause any inflation that should worry anybody. What does cause inflation, is things like spending on highly specialized jobs, military spending, etc. But that's not what we're asking for here.
Right, and so essentially is that what we're saying is we're saying we would increase the money supply by hiring these people into this federal transition job. However, by doing that, we would also be increasing the goods and services that could be purchased because they would be doing something.
Correct.
Right? And so, the supply goes up and the demand goes up. We shouldn't really see any inflation until we hit a point where the money supply continues to go up and the goods and services can't follow because, as you said, productive capacity has been realized or everybody's been employed. Or if we start putting resources toward a sector or an area where it's not available for consumer goods, like you said, the military. Right. For example.
Exactly. So as long as we don't have full employment and we actually spend money on giving people simple jobs to have purchasing power, etc., we don't need to worry about inflation. Yeah.
So what about keeping track of all this mess? So we all know that the government, if we compare it to the efficacy of the private sector, they love taking way too long, going way over budget, and even if we could say we have infinite money, going over budget is in a sense inflationary because you paid more for it than you would have otherwise because you didn't get it done on the correct budget. How do we know that we're not sending all these people to work on something that's just potentially useless?
Well, I think that would be achieved through having a as decentralized a transition job as possible, where you make the money available via federal grants, but local communities decide what should be done with the money, if that makes sense.
Yeah, can you walk through something that would look like a real example of that?
Well, for example, cleaning up trash in your area, or there has been a program in Argentina called the Jefes program, where people actually, I think when, started producing textiles, they were used by the military and police, etc. So it could just be very simple things that are easy to track, not overly complicated, yet they instill discipline, give you, don't get people stuck in unemployment, etc. Something along those lines.
And it's interesting you brought up stuck in unemployment and instilling discipline, because there's one thing that Warren Mosler describes very well, which is that the private sector, for whatever reason, doesn't like to hire people who are unemployed.
Oh, totally.
And I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out why. I mean, if you own a business and someone comes and applies for a job and they say, "Oh yeah, I haven't had a job in 6 months," what's your gut telling you as a business owner? Going, well, why haven't you had a job in 6 months? Maybe I should hire somebody who is a little more familiar with this working thing.
Exactly.
And so it bottlenecks the unemployed, because naturally I want to look for someone who can show, as you said, the discipline of putting themselves toward a job. The federal transition job, because it would accept whoever came, with a caveat, of course, they would have to show up, they would have to work, they would have to be on time, there would be a schedule that you would have to adhere to. You can get fired. By being able to simply get that on their resume, they may be more. Half of the battle is getting them more attractive to this private sector employer in the first place.
Yeah.
And furthermore, this is one of the things that I find very fascinating about this concept, is that if we get over the fact that, sometimes a community needs more money, Like there's this big fears if you inject one more dollar into the economy, it's going to inflate that economy by one more dollar. But as we went over, that's only once we've hit a productive capacity. And if you see particularly smaller communities where there's not a whole lot going on, they could really use some more cash in that community. And now if you have a situation where the local community, say, gets this federal grant where they're essentially tapping into this federal government power of being able to create money, they get this federal grant where they can start employing people who are unemployed or who wouldn't be working otherwise. And instead of costing the community money, it actually generates money for the community. So these people who, let's say, there's a group of 100 people who get employed for $8 an hour when the minimum wage is $10 an hour, at this federal transition job. Well, the money that they're creating theoretically gets spent within that local community. Now that the money is getting spent within the local community, the local community, the business owners, their revenues go up. If their revenues go up, they're incentivized to hire new people. And the goal would be is to introduce enough money into the community that they hire these people out of the federal transition job because they can offer a better wage. Because one of the most important points of the federal transition job, as you said, Nima, is that it can't compete with the private sector. You can't set a wage that interferes with the wages of the private sector. That when the private sector pulls these people out because now there's enough money in the community moving around to do so, that stops the money creation. So it creates this natural force that says, okay, we need more money, start injecting the money. And once we start feeling that we've had enough money injected into the community, the private sector will naturally hire them out and halt the money creation. It's kind of this cool counterbalance.
Yeah, and important to mention also, it's not we're creating magic resources out of nowhere. It's just that the resources have not been utilized the way they should be used based on the amount that they're taxed. It always goes back to that. It's not that we are creating...
Explore that idea.
Well, yeah, it's
based on the amount. Resources aren't utilized based on the amount that we're taxed. Yeah. This is totally bizarre coming from an idea that, the free sector could just make its own money and utilize its own resources.
Yeah. So, if people have a certain amount of tax to pay, then that takes away from their net private savings. And when the net private savings is taken away, then people spend less and cling on to as much cash as they can, and so on and so forth. And then they won't spend that money, but they could have spent it, and there could have been employment generated, but it wasn't because of the high tax. It always goes back to the tax being too high in comparison with the spending, with the injection of the money.
Right. So not enough deficit.
Exactly. Government deficit. Exactly. So we want a government deficit. Government deficit is good because it injects net private savings to the extent that we want to eliminate unemployment, and then obviously beyond that we don't. Or we can have, but we'll discuss this some other time. Maybe next time we talk about sectoral balances. If you don't solve it through government deficit, you can through current account surplus, but there's no other way to allow for the private sector to have sufficient net private savings. Obviously, cutting taxes is also a big thing that we're both for, and we've discussed that before as well. We can get more into that on another show, but we could easily eliminate a huge portion of all of today's taxes, and thus increase the deficit without any more government spending, and thus allow for more private sector savings, and so on and so forth. But the job guarantee we're discussing would just be something a little supportive tool in addition to that, in order to employ some of the resources that just won't be employed. Because, there's always a little tax that causes some degree of unemployment at some point. And for that reason, the transition job would just be a great, would make the whole process of moving in and out of the
transitioning.
Yeah, exactly. Transitioning would just make the whole process so much more smooth. Another thing I want to touch on is I think we intuitively, at least it was for me, was the case sort of libertarian-minded people really underestimate the significance of unemployment. Because I actually, at one point, I used to believe, well, we actually want to be unemployed. We all work so much, we want to have so much savings and money that one day we don't need to work anymore. So, what's wrong with unemployment? There are people, I know that, who think there's nothing really wrong with unemployment per se, because don't we all just want to, at one point, just sit there and live in paradise and do nothing? But it's really, the problems that are caused by unemployment are so vast and so significant that it really cannot be overstated. Just a couple of things off the top of my head that are caused by unemployment are crime, drug abuse, incarceration rates, domestic violence, alcoholism. Okay, I had that under drug abuse, depression. World War II, arguably, some people say, or Hitler coming to power was because there was a bunch of unemployed World War I vets, so political problems. I don't know. Can you think of any other things? There's so many things that we spend so much money on and that we're taxed so much for that could be eliminated by a not very significant federal transition job program. Maybe it could be done at maybe 1% of GDP or something like that,
What, and that 1% of GDP, let's explore that, because it sounds daunting, because I'm sure everyone has in their mind when you hear federal, and even though we say federal transition job, everyone's thinking federal job guarantee. And honestly, Nima and I both think this is a little bit of a misnomer to call it the federal job guarantee, because the point is not to permanently guarantee jobs for people. Like maybe there's a couple modern politicians that appear to be pushing this. The point, as we said, is to transition people into the private sector, because the private sector can't cause this government created problem, which is paying for your taxes. As of right now, and I'm getting this from economist's book, Randy Ray. It's a primer on modern money theory. I think he wrote it like in 2010 or 2012 or so. That at the time, roughly 10% of GDP right now, or excuse me, at that time, I'm sure it hasn't changed much, goes toward welfare spending. 10% goes toward paying people not to work. And so if you're saying that it's like maybe 1% to pay people to work, how could that possibly be a step in the wrong direction?
Exactly. That is such a huge point. I totally agree.
Well, and I also want to go back and touch on what you mentioned about, potentially Hitler having risen to power because there were so many angry, unemployed Germans. And obviously it's a little more complex than that, but I don't think that you could deny that that was a very large driving force, that if, these people had decent jobs and were able to afford a place to live and start a family, they might not have had the political vigor to send Germany down the path that it got sent down. And I think anyone who's been unemployed for a while, and assuming you're not like a welfare bum who's proud of it, anyone who's been unemployed for a while, it's really degrading. Like you kind of feel hopeless and useless. Like I'm not in control of my life anymore because I'm not able to earn the money that I need to do anything.
Yeah, the psychological
it's
huge. You're right.
It's rough.
Yeah.
But let's go into again the potential costs of this. So again, you said potentially 1% of GDP. It would be that cheap to employ everybody.
Yeah. And then imagine all the monies that could be avoided, and the private sector in effect could actually be much larger in the end than it is right now. So.
Right, because it gets the funds injected that it needs. And, here's one thing that I want to say on top of that. And I think I emphasize this because I live in a smaller town, and I usually find myself in smaller towns, partially because I live near Seattle and I can't stand the place. When I go to these smaller towns, and I think a lot of this has to do with zoning as well, that doesn't allow these places to build. But these places are strapped for cash, and anybody who has any money there drives to Seattle to work. And they drive back, and, with the way the traffic's been getting, it could be a 2 or 3 hour commute one way. And I think being able to give these communities access to the federal money creation power, and I'm not talking about employing these people going to Seattle in this federal transition job. What I'm saying is this could give the cash to these communities that the communities need, that maybe they could create a business strong enough.
Good point.
To start employing people a little more locally,
exactly,
with real jobs, not just these transition jobs.
Yeah, I think that the current system, the austerity system, is to a large extent, it just gives the cities a lot of control and power, and it drains
the big cities. You mean
the big cities, and it drains rural communities of spending power that could have stayed there. I think that's such a huge point, and you could almost speculate that there's conspiracies to make it so. There are people who have a vested interest in keeping people unemployed and forcing them to move to the big city to work there. And, in a way, that's sort of almost, that's been the history of civilization. But this...
Well, I mean, I guess I'll pull out my tinfoil hat a little bit. And this goes back to the environmental regulations. Part of me... And no one would know this from listening to us yet, I've been studying and getting into real estate investing. I'm working on getting my second deal under contract right now. And part of what I've been doing is looking into... I found a local government that's theoretically wanting to save the fish up in the mountains, because, they go up the stream from the ocean. And so they're trying to buy properties so no one can live on them next to these streams. And I went into the ordinances, it's a Seattle City ordinance, and I literally found the ordinances that said, blah, 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 we want to save the fish. Oh, and in addition, this helps with the fact that we want to keep people from living in rural communities and get them into the cities.
There you go. Yeah.
And I know that we don't necessarily have a direct connection to that and the money theory that we're saying now, but I mean, it doesn't take a whole leap of faith to go around to, smaller communities outside of big cities and see they're strapped for cash. And if they want cash, they got to go to the big city to get it.
Exactly.
So I could really see something like this federal transition job, giving more opportunity back to these local communities so we don't all get crunched into these massive urban centers.
Yeah. Yeah, it would create a lot more balance, I think.
So
yeah.
Do you have anything really big to hit left on this?
Yeah.
I think we pretty much hit it.
I think
Go ahead.
I would like if you could read from Randy Ray's Modern Money Theory, where he discusses how the transition job is consistent with libertarianism. Because if I recall, he has a chapter in there specifically. I just don't have the book on me right now. Sorry, I'm in Germany right now. I'm out of the country. We have a truly global transmission going on right now. But if you could read that section, that would be I think that would be an eye opener.
So this is on page 246. It's a summary of his chapter on the federal transition job. So he says, to sum it up, MMT is consistent with any size of government. It can be a small libertarian government if desired, but it issues a sovereign floating currency. It supports the currency by imposing a tax payable in that currency. And then he goes on to say, a job guarantee, or he also calls it an employer of last resort, what we're calling the federal transition job, is also consistent with any size of government. If you want a big private sector and a small government sector, keep taxes and government spending low. That frees up the resources, and that's the big key there, that frees up the resources to be used by the big private sector. But you will still need a job guarantee to take up the labor resources the private sector cannot fully employ. Here's his jab. If Austrians are right about the efficacy of private markets, the job guarantee will always be small. And that goes back to what I was saying about the private sector always desiring to pull the people working in the federal working in the federal transition job out of it as soon as they're capable of doing so, because if they're making enough income, they're incentivized to hire people, and those would be the most readily available people to hire.
Exactly. I think that is such a clincher for even for the staunchest of libertarians, that you can really have this program. We're not making any political recommendations. We are saying that this program is consistent really with any type of political opinions. If you want a large government or if you want a small government, this program applies equally. Its validity it applies equally. It doesn't matter whether you're a so-called democratic socialist or a hardcore libertarian. I mean, you and I, we are anarcho-capitalists, yet we recognize the requirements of the system, and for that reason, this is what it is. And if we want to,
and the discussion really needs to be about not whether or not we should have it, but what we should be doing with it.
Yeah, how we should implement it. But we're not there yet. Currently we're at the stage of, do we need it? Because there's still a lot of educational work to be done.
Do people even understand it?
Yeah, do we even know how the money system works? Exactly. And
go ahead, finish your thought.
No, sorry.
I wanted to get into this before we tuned out, because I think we've covered all the angles. I want to bring up, I think both Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez, I think I'm pronouncing her name right.
I think it's Ocasio-Castro.
Both.
Or did I get that wrong? Oh, sorry. So sorry.
They both brought, Castro has not introduced it because she hasn't been elected, but she has said she has wanted to introduce it, and Bernie Sanders has actually introduced essentially a new deal, FDR style New Deal. And I want to emphasize that we are not suggesting that. And one of the big things, and we said this at the beginning, is that one of the prime things about this concept is it cannot compete with the private sector. And because the private sector at the moment already has minimum wages, we know that, whatever wage that you set this job to be would effectively be a minimum wage. You would either set this job at the current minimum wage or a hair lower. Yeah. Because that way you're not pulling people out of the private sector into the federal transition job, which is, I don't know what's going on in these people between Ocasio and Sanders' heads, but I feel like that's what they want to push toward, is putting more and more people into the public sector. Absolutely. That is their political opinion, and we have a different political opinion, and the programs and the validity of money theory applies nonetheless in any of those cases. And with that, I think we've covered it all. And if you have any questions or comments or rants, rank, hatred, etc., hit us up. Check out the show notes for references.
This has been Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Nima of economicsjunkie.com, and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network on YouTube. And we are on the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. Till next time.